Let's move on to our next speaker then. Thank you, Davin, for that overview. We have two speakers left. The first, Lisa Emberson, who will discuss the crop impact assessment of this study, and then we'll have Susan Annenberg come back and present what the health impact assessment findings were of this study. And please continue to send your questions through so that we'll have a chance to pose those to each of the speakers. So Lisa is one of the co-authors of this study. She and her colleague Chris Malley at the Stockholm Environment Institute, based at the University of York, were the ones that conducted this assessment. Lisa has been gracious to join us from South Africa and has been listening quietly to all of this today. With that, let's listen to Lisa's presentation now on the crop impact methods and findings from this study. So with that, Lisa, I will pass it over to you.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Ray, and hello everybody as well. I'm going to describe the methodology and some of the key results that came out of our crop impact assessment. So here we were trying to understand what the changes in the excess diesel NOx emissions what sort of effect they would have on crop impacts around the globe. So if we go on to the next slide, we can start thinking about why we wanted to consider crop impacts, and that's really driven by the fact that there's a lot of evidence, empirical evidence, which have been collected over the past 20 or 30 years or so, which shows that certain pollutants that are formed from NOx are having quite serious and substantial impacts on crops globally. So as Susan described initially, NOx is a precursor to ozone and aerosol or particulate matter pollution. If we think about ozone, then that's a phytotoxic pollutant, so it's actually toxic to vegetation. And if we think about aerosol, that also has effects on the quality and quantity of solar radiation, which will impact on photosynthesis, which is driven by solar radiation, and therefore on biomass of plants. In terms of ozone, some of the effects that we see include visible injury, and there's an image there to your right which shows this sort of visible injury for soybean growing in Europe. It also causes biomass losses, it causes crop yield losses, forest productivity losses, and we can also see changes in the species composition of productive grasslands due to ozone. Aerosols, as I said, will alter photosynthesis. That will change carbon assimilation and have an effect on biomass. And as well as these more direct effects of ozone and aerosol pollutants on plants, they can also affect other ecosystem services. So for example, these pollutants can affect the gas exchange, which allow the transfer of carbon dioxide and water vapor across the leaf surface. And this can have impacts on transpiration, which will then have a knock-on effect on things like hydrology. So can actually change stream flow within catchments. Because we are seeing reductions in the amount of biomass of plants, that means that we have less carbon being sequestered in plants, and that means that we have more carbon dioxide being left in the atmosphere. So we have a carbon sequestration effect, which can actually sort of feed forward to further enhance climate change. And we also see changes in atmosphere-biosphere exchange of things like water through the evapotranspiration stream, and this can have implications on energy budgets as well, as we perhaps lose the evaporative cooling effect of vegetation. So we wanted to get some idea of the role of excess diesel NOx on vegetation across the globe, and we really wanted to focus on some of those impacts that have a very well-established methodology that we really felt confident in being able to quantify the impact. So here we focused on the ozone effect on crop yields for 3 staple crops. But in a similar way, as Susan described for the human health impact assessment, where really we were just looking at the premature deaths that were caused by these excess diesel NOx emissions, we're again in this crop impact assessment just looking at a small subsection, if you like, of the impacts that these pollutants, which are produced from NOx could actually be causing to vegetation. Okay, so if we go on to the next slide, this shows the methodology that we use. So this methodology was first used by Van Dinkenen et al. In 2009. It's a robust methodology which has been used a number of times recently by other global studies. So we have confidence that this methodology is going to be giving us sensible answers. So we take the ozone hourly surface concentrations that come out of Geoschem that Davin was just describing earlier. We convert those into metrics which allow us to characterize the ozone so that it gives us the best prediction of how the yield of different crops will change. And then we also need to know when our crops are actually present globally. So we need to identify country level growing seasons of those crops, the start of the growing season, and then we start to accumulate those metrics, those damage metrics, over a 3-month growing season period. We can combine those accumulated metrics with our damage function, similar to the concentration response function that Susan will talk about in terms of the human health studies, and that gives us an idea of the crop relative yield loss. We can then combine that information with crop production, which we get per country, and then also using a crop-specific suitability index, which gives us an idea of the distribution of the crops across the countries and across the globe. Bringing together that crop production and crop relative yield loss information, we can then get an estimate of our gridded crop production loss. So if we go on to the next slide, in terms of this methodology, there's one particular aspect that's quite useful or important to consider in terms of interpreting the results. This shows again the slide that Davin showed of how ozone concentrations change with each of the different NOx scenarios around the globe. So you can see that there's quite large differences in terms of just the total absolute ozone concentrations and also the changes that you see for each of the scenarios that are brought on. And then the bottom image there gives you an idea of the crop production for wheat. So again, you can see there that there's quite a lot of heterogeneity in terms of where wheat is actually distributed across the globe. So where we're trying to understand the results that we have to bear in mind the fact that our crop distribution is only going to be impacted by changes in our ozone, which also has a variable distribution globally. So we're going to see some differences when we look at different crops and by different region. Okay, if we go on to the next slide. So I just wanted to focus a little bit more on the damage function or the concentration response function that we used. And the next slide will show the two different concentration response functions that we used. So we used an M7, which is basically giving us a 7-hour mean ozone concentration for a 3-month growing season. And then we also used something called an AOT40 concentration response function. So this metric is actually accumulating the ozone concentrations that are above 40 ppb, again over that 3-month growing season. And you can see that we've got a relationship between these different metrics. As they increase, you'll see a decrease in the yield of the 3 crops that we looked at: wheat, maize, and soy. The M7 function we believe, is a better predictor of more chronic ozone pollution. So where you have a growing season where the ozone concentration tends to be fairly constant across that whole entire growing season. The M7 should give us a good estimate of the relative yield for those conditions. By contrast, the AOT40 metric tends to emphasize the higher ozone concentration. So we believe that this is giving us a better yield when we're looking at peak ozone pollution episodes that might occur over that 3-month period. So if you just go on to the next slide, then we assume that by looking at both of these two metrics, we're getting a reasonable idea of the range of uncertainty in the relative yield loss estimates that we got from the study. Next slide. Then comes to some of the results. If you click again, then you'll see the results that we have for the crop production loss that we estimate as a percentage. And here we can see each set of bars gives us the baseline for 2015 and 2040, and then the respective limit 2015, and then the respective NOx emission scenarios. And the top three sets of bars give us the global picture for soy, wheat, and maize. And then the bottom 7 set of bars pick out certain crops in certain regions where we found particularly interesting results. So I'll go through some of the standout results that we had if we go on to the next slide. We can first think about this in terms of what would happen if no interventions were to take place. How would our crop production loss change? So this is really looking to see the difference between the baseline 2050 and then going out to baseline 2040 in terms of how ozone concentrations are going to change. With this picture globally, we tend to see an improvement in crop production. So soy has the biggest improvement with a reduced crop production loss of around about 2%, followed by maize at 0.8% and wheat at 0.4%. However, when we look at the regional level, we see quite large variation in terms of those crop production losses. So in Brazil, the soybean crop sees an increase in the crop production loss of about 1.2%, and similarly, Indian wheat sees an increase of about 2.8%. We see the largest improvements in crop production in US soy and US maize of about 4% and 1.2% respectively. And the EU wheat sees about a 1% reduction in crop production loss. So if we move on to the results which actually looked at the effects of the different NOx emission scenarios. So this is really thinking, well, how much better could things be if we're in 2040, we're at that projected ozone concentration, but then we start to bring in some of these NOx emission scenarios that Josh was talking about earlier. So globally, we would see small improvements in crop production of around about 0.1 to 0.2% for soy, wheat and maize, and these tend to increment with each increased stringency of each intervention of those different emission scenarios that Josh described before. But within that global picture, there are some standout results, which again depend on the region and the crop type. So for example, Brazil's soy sees about a 1.6% reduction in crop production loss from the baseline 2040 using the Euro 6 standards. China maize and wheat also see about a 1% and a 1.6% reduction in crop production loss from the baseline 2040 again to that Euro 6 standard. And then when you look at the US for maize and for soy, it's only really with the next generation set of emission reduction scenarios that you start to see any substantial reduction in crop production loss. So with the next slide, I can just conclude with what some of the main take-home messages from this part of the study were. So we can see that there are effects of changes in excess diesel NOx on crop production loss, and that these really do depend on the crop distribution, both in relation to the current 2015 and then also the projected 2014 ozone concentration levels. This effect seems to be see some substantial differences in those limit 2015 to baseline 2014 crop production losses. So in some crops in some regions, we're seeing quite large improvements in crop production, for example, US soy, whilst in others we're seeing worsening crop production, for example, India wheat, which sees about a 2% increase in that crop production loss. However, a key point here, I think, is that in all cases, more stringent NOx emission controls through those emission scenarios, we'll see improvements in crop production. Most notably, we see improvements of soy in Brazil and wheat and maize in China. Now, we know that there's uncertainty in the estimates that we've made of these crop production losses. We've tried as best as we can to attempt to quantify these uncertainties by using those two different damage functions, the M7 and the AOT40. If you look at those different damage functions and the uncertainty associated with them in terms of the percentage of crop production loss, then they tend to vary between plus minus 0.2% to plus minus 10%. across the different regions and the different crops selected. And finally, I think just to come back and make that point again, that this study has only looked at the effects of excess diesel NOx on yields of 3 staple crops, and only due to the one pollutant, ozone. We know that this misses other crops, which will be important in different regions. It also misses impacts on the quality of crops. We know that these pollutants can affect the nutritional quality of these crops, for example, and also the visible injury, which can cause changes in economic value, particularly of leafy vegetables, for example. We miss the effects on productive grasslands. For example, we know again that in terms of quality, forage quality of grasses, productive grasslands can be altered, which would have implications for livestock, for example. And we also miss the effects on forest productivity and the other ecosystem services that I mentioned previously. Those are all ozone effects. We're also aware of the fact that we're missing completely the effects of the aerosol and the PM on plant productivity. So I think that's something just to bear in mind as we are considering what these results show us, that they're perhaps erring on the side of caution in terms of the actual impacts that we might expect to see. And with that, I can finish.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Question for you about the harm, sort of the general harm of nitrogen oxide emissions on crop production. A couple of questions about making the point that when we think about diesel NOx, you know, the issues raised are generally around public health and around this being kind of an urban kind of environment issue. But your research is, I think, making clear that there is harm that is occurring on the environment outside of cities and not limited just to human beings. If you could comment on the kind of the general harm or the potential harm of anthropogenic nitrogen oxides on crop production. So I think that's probably the most important question, if you could answer that. And then if you could follow up on that specifically on India and anything that you can comment on relating to anthropogenic NOx and its effects on Indian specific crops.
Okay, yeah, so I suppose in terms of NOx, I think we can sort of refer back to the answer that Davan gave as well, in terms of, you know, our study was capturing in many ways all the NOx emissions to try and set that baseline ozone concentration. So NOx is a very large contributor to the formation of ozone. Ozone is a secondary pollutant which is formed under the action of sunlight. So that means that it becomes actually really quite important in terms of agricultural impacts. You'll tend to have your NOx being emitted from your urban areas or your industrial areas. It will then sort of move in a package of air downwind, and the photochemical reactions will take some time, so that you're only actually getting the higher concentrations of ozone being formed normally when that package of air is actually sat over rural areas. And because it requires sunlight to drive those photochemical reactions, and because agricultural productivity also provides sunlight, then you tend to get quite high ozone concentrations at the same time as you have quite high agricultural productivity. So that's why NOx in particular is a problem in terms of agriculture, because it leads to the formation of ozone, which will then cause substantial impacts to agricultural productivity. And if we think about India, which was the other part of your question, you have quite an interesting constellation, especially in northern India, around something called the Indo-Gangetic Plain, which is sort of sometimes referred to as the breadbasket of South Asia, where you have lots of rice and wheat being grown in rotation. That actually sits quite close to quite a large number of industrial activities in some of the largest cities in northern India. So again, you're getting the NOx being pumped out of those cities and those industrial areas, moving downwind, forming ozone under those photochemical reactions, and then causing really, according to modelling studies, really quite large impacts on the wheat and rice that is actually grown in that region.
Great, thank you, Lisa, for that response.